As terrorism spreads across Europe, Germany is a nation under siege. Bombings and kidnappings are only the beginning. The hijacking of an airliner threatens 87 lives. Held at gunpoint and surrounded by explosives, the passengers have one hope of survival. The GSG-9, Germany's elite special forces unit.
In an era of global violence, a new breed of warrior has emerged to counter the threat. Superbly trained, fearless, and equipped with massive firepower, these men are an elite few. Their teams are hand-picked, their operations covert, their missions deadly. From around the globe, these are the untold stories of the Special Forces.
In 1977, the city of Cologne was a thriving business center on the western border of Germany. On September 5th, the director of the Mercedes-Benz Corporation left his office for the day. 3 bodyguards followed in a separate car. Hans Martin Schleier was a prominent international businessman. But in Germany, success made him a target for terrorism. In the 1970s, radical factions of Europe's student movement declared war on capitalist governments. Riots, bombings, and kidnappings spread across the continent. Germany was hardest hit. The Baader-Meinhof gang attacked cities all over the country. The German government launched a massive manhunt for the terrorists. 11 were arrested, including gang leaders Andreas Baader, Ulrich Wegener, and Jean-Carl Raspe. With their leaders now in jail, the Baader-Meinhof gang vowed to retaliate. On April 7, 1977, they gunned down a federal prosecutor and his bodyguards. On July 30th, the president of Germany's largest bank was murdered. Then, on September 5th, 5 Baader-Meinhof gang members moved into position on a street in Cologne. Hans Martin Schleier was next on their list. In 90 seconds, they slaughtered 4 bodyguards and kidnapped Hans Martin Schleier. It was a brutally efficient operation. Within hours, the government deployed the GSG-9, Germany's special forces. The unit was formed in 1972, 2 weeks after Palestinian gunmen murdered 11 Israeli athletes at the Olympic Games in Munich. Over the next 5 years, the GSG-9 received the best counterterrorism training in the world. Colonel Ulrich Wegener founded and commanded the unit.
When Hans Martin Schleier was kidnapped, by the terrorists, we had to go after them before Mr. Schleier will be killed.
The GSG-9 launched a citywide search for Schleier and his kidnappers.
In one case, we did an assault in the city of Cologne, and it came out it was a drug smuggler.
The day after the kidnapping, a tip led the GSG-9 to an abandoned van. Inside, they found a letter addressed to the German government. A copy was sent to an official in Wiesbaden as well. In the letter, the kidnappers identified themselves as members of the Baader-Meinhof gang. They demanded the release of their leaders from prison. If the German government refused to comply, Schleier was a dead man. Gang leaders Andreas Baader and Jean-Karl Raspa had been convicted of 4 murders and 54 counts of attempted murder. To release them, along with 9 other terrorists, was unthinkable. But in the week following Schleier's abduction, the German government played along. Each inmate was asked to fill out a questionnaire. It was a tactic devised by the German Minister of State, Hans-Jürgen Wisniewski.
It was all about buying time. Time we needed to search for Schleier and find him alive. We went to the prisoners who were to be released and asked them if they were prepared to travel, and if so, where to. The following locations were given: Libya, Iraq, Yemen, and Vietnam.
All of the prisoners had chosen the same destinations. They were communicating between cells using Morse code. Even in solitary confinement, the terrorists continued to maneuver. As an experienced diplomat, Minister Wisniewski was one step ahead. He met with representatives of each of the 4 countries.
I went personally to all these places in order to shut the door tightly. I asked these countries to promise us they wouldn't give asylum to any of the terrorists in question.
After 5 weeks of waiting, the kidnappers' patience wore thin. Clearly, the government was stalling. It was time to raise the stakes. The Baader-Meinhof gang enlisted the aid of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. On October 13, 1977, 82 passengers and 5 crew members boarded Lufthansa Flight 181 in Palma de Mallorca, a small island off the coast of Spain. The passengers, mostly German tourists, were flying to Frankfurt. Beate Keller was 21 years old at the time. She was one of 11 German beauty contestants returning from a pageant.
We arrived at the airport late, only a half hour prior to takeoff. They let us go through security without being searched. We were taken out onto the tarmac and rode out to the plane on a bus. But one of the passengers on the bus with us was not part of our group. He had also bypassed security and got on the plane this way as well.
45 minutes into the flight, the crew served lunch. One of the gunmen rushed the cockpit.
This is hijacking!
Co-pilot Jürgen Wegener was forced out.
He aimed his pistol at Captain Schumann's head and kicked me with his right foot. Out, go out, he yelled. It was obvious it was a hijacking. There were 3 others whom I didn't see at that moment because there was an awful commotion in the airplane at this point. Later it turned out there were 4 of them, 3 more in the main cabin.
This is my plane now. You do what I say, when I say, or I kill you dead. Stay down! Stay down! Shut up! Get your hands up!
The hijackers forced the passengers to the back of the plane.
Und alle Plätze von hinten praktisch.
All the seats from the back were filled, leaving no gaps, and all the passengers were seated in a large block. They made free space in first class. They wanted to create a buffer zone for themselves.
Everyone, keep your hands up. Obey the orders of my officers.
The leader of the hijackers identified himself as Captain Martyr Mahmoud. His group had hijacked the plane to secure the release of all 11 Badr Meinhof leaders, plus 2 convicted Palestinians. The passengers aboard Flight 181 had become bargaining chips in a dangerous game. And they were being held by the most violent terrorist organization in the world.
Stay calm, stay down, listen to the orders, keep your hands up, and no one will be hurt. If you do not comply, I will destroy this plane.
In Germany, Minister Wisniewski received word that a Lufthansa jet was in jeopardy.
We first got the news about the hijacking while we were having a cabinet meeting. We prepared ourselves for the deployment of the Special Forces, the GSG-9.
While half the unit remained in Cologne to search for Schleier, the other half, the assault team, went after the hijackers.
One of the main jobs we trained was the anti-skyjacking. That means the assault on hijackers in an aircraft. We were sure that we could do the assault to free the hostages.
Already a Boeing 707 with civilian markings was in the air and tailing the terrorists. On board were commandos from the GSG-9.
Wir haben ungefähr 35 Minuten, bis wir in Zypern landen. Ich will gerade die Zeit noch nutzen, über das Flugzeug zu sprechen.
I had the possibility to take an Air Force aircraft as a commando aircraft, but I decided not to do this and to take a Lufthansa civilian aircraft because I was afraid that we may face problems when we go to a foreign country with an Air Force aircraft.
Wherever Flight 181 landed, the GSG-9's mission was clear: to secure the aircraft and liberate the hostages. As point man for the unit, Joachim Hummer needed accurate intelligence.
We
only received sporadic information that our captain picked up over the radio. The media had reported how many people were on board. We heard there were 86, mainly vacationing Germans. This was all the information we had.
The hijackers forced the plane to land in Rome for refueling.
This is Captain Martin Mahmoud.
Mahmoud radioed the tower.
This airplane now.
In addition to the release of the Badr Meinhof prisoners, the PFLP wanted 2 Palestinians freed and $15 million in cash.
And 15 million US dollars.
If the German government complied, Hans-Martin Schleier and the passengers would be released unharmed.
Whatever country of their choice, that is all.
Air traffic control in Rome relayed the hijackers' demands to the GSG-9 cockpit. German authorities tried to have the plane detained in Rome. But Flight 181 was soon refueled and taxiing for takeoff.
Eventually, we took off without clearance. Mahmoud, the leader, was in the cockpit. The others were in the back guarding the plane. He forced us to take off regardless of the consequences, and we did.
The GSG-9 was 2 hours behind. On board the plane, the commandos studied blueprints of the hijacked airliner. Flight 181 was a standard Boeing 737 jet with a center aisle and 6 exits. They knew the layout of their target and how many passengers were on board. But that's all they knew. Dieter Fox was the unit's second in command.
Man wusste auch, dass wer an Bord war. Man hat das akzeptiert, man hat Informationen ausgetauscht.
At that time, nobody knew how many hijackers were actually on board and who those hijackers were. None of us knew because only one of them did the talking. Only this Mahmoud talked. And if he himself didn't want to speak, he had his statements delivered by Captain Schumann.
Air traffic control in Rome radioed with an update. The hijacked plane's destination was still unclear, but it was headed for the Middle East.
It was important for us to consider the different possibilities and what we could expect in what countries. It was a brand new thought process from a tactical point of view.
The commandos followed the jet into hostile airspace. On board Flight 181, the situation became critical. The plane was dangerously low on fuel. Wegener needed to find an airstrip.
We were headed for Beirut, but weren't allowed to land. Damascus, again, gave no clearance. Then we flew towards Baghdad, but clearance was refused. Kuwait was next, but no clearance.
We must land.
It was a disaster in the making as Arab countries turned their backs on the hijackers. Mahmoud grew anxious and then enraged. There was nothing Captain Schumann could do.
I was sure that they had to come down, to get down, they had to land somewhere.
Co-pilot Wegener calculated they had 6 minutes of fuel remaining. If the captain didn't land immediately, everyone on Flight 181 would die. In 1977, Germany faced an escalating crisis. On September 5th, the Baader-Meinhof gang kidnapped Hans Martin Schleier, a prominent businessman in Cologne. Over a month later, Palestinians hijacked a German jet. Both groups had one goal: to free 13 convicted terrorists from prison. The GSG-9 assault team pursued the plane from Europe to the Middle East. Hijacked Flight 181 had flown over 2,000 miles and was nearly out of fuel.
You must land this plane now!
Mahmoud ordered Captain Schumann to land in Bahrain. The small Middle Eastern country was their only hope. Bahrain refused permission to land. Schumann was out of options. In minutes, the plane would drop from the sky. The captain advised Bahrain he intended to land with or without permission. When Flight 181 finally touched down, it had 3 minutes of fuel left in its tanks.
We received word that they had landed in Bahrain. We could only imagine what was going on in the hijacked plane.
The GSG-9 was 2 hours away. They radioed ahead to airport officials. The jet should be detained. Bahrain wanted no part of an international incident. They refueled the jet and ordered Schumann to leave. Flight 181 had just enough fuel to clear Bahraini airspace. A few hours later, air traffic control informed the GSG-9. The hijackers had landed in the United Arab Emirates. Flight 181 sat on the runway in the city of Dubai. Conditions for the passengers had deteriorated. There was little food or water. Mahmoud, the lead hijacker, issued an ultimatum to the tower. He addressed Sheikh Mohammed, the country's defense minister. If the terrorists' demands were not met by noon on October 16th, they would blow up the plane. Authorities had 2 days to comply. The GSG-9 landed in Dubai a short time later. They had to figure out how to assault the plane without jeopardizing the passengers.
Denn es ist schon schwierig genug, eine Maschine zu stürmen, wenn sie bereits am Boden
It's one thing to attack a plane on the ground, quite another to have to land and go from one plane to the other, because the element of surprise is lost, and you can expect heavy casualties.
At the request of the German government, 2 British SAS commandos joined the GSG-9 in Dubai. They brought with them the latest in counterterrorism technology, stun grenades. Barry Davies was a sergeant in the British SAS.
The stun grenades, which are commonly known as flashbangs, explode in a series of bangs, and in between the bangs there is a very bright flash. The effect of the full power operational stun grenade is quite devastating.
The flashbangs would stun everyone on board the plane for exactly 5 seconds. That was how long the GSG-9 would have to breach the plane, target the hijackers, and eliminate them. As the GSG-9 finalized their plan, politics came into play. The government of the United Arab Emirates refused to allow foreign soldiers to operate within their borders.
We saw that they had no intention to give us the permission to do that there, to do the operation there.
On board the hijacked jet, Mahmoud left the cockpit long enough for Captain Schumann and co-pilot Wegener to talk openly.
Und als mal eine kurze Pause war, wo wir allein waren, hat mich gefragt, du meinst du, Jürgen, wir sollen...
He asked me, "What do you think, Jürgen? Should we smuggle out messages?" I told him, "We are in a country, a part of the world about which we know nothing at all. I wouldn't do it," I said. "We don't know what is going on in front of our own plane, and that is a very dangerous situation."
Schumann decided to risk it. Mahmoud had authorized the captain to order supplies. In addition to food and water, he requested 4 Arabic newspapers and 4 cigars.
I was sure that he wanted to give us a message, and the number, cigars, what it could only mean that there were 4 terrorists.
Captain Schumann had provided a vital piece of intelligence. Authorities now knew how many hijackers they were dealing with. That afternoon, the plane's batteries ran dry. As the hours dragged on, the situation became more tense. Authorities in Dubai worked to keep Mahmoud calm. For the passengers, conditions went from bad to worse. They had been in Dubai for 2 days.
Ja, also es war ja so, dass wir die Klimaanlage war ja auch.
The air conditioning system stopped working. The temperature rose to 150 degrees inside. We thought we were going to die.
The passengers needed air. When Mahmoud accepted supplies, he left the doors of the plane open.
And so the first time we could see the terrorists. And one of my boys, he took a number of photographs there, which was very helpful, of course. And we gave the photographs to some members of the intelligence.
The leader of the hijackers, the man who called himself Mahmoud, was identified as a Palestinian named Zohar Akache. A year earlier, he was accused of assassinating the Prime Minister of North Yemen. According to authorities, Akache was a ruthless terrorist with an international reputation.
And so we knew that that they mean business, you know.
The situation looked grim for the passengers and for Hans Martin Schleier. The kidnapped businessman had been missing for over a month. In Dubai, the heat intensified as the day wore on. A ground power unit was delivered to the plane so the captain could run the air conditioner. To Mahmoud, the Lufthansa mechanics driving the truck looked like soldiers.
And when they were about 100 meters far from the aircraft, the terrorists thought that they might cover in an attack or something like this. And so they opened fire. And it was, I questioned the Lufthansa mechanics afterwards, and one was a former service member, and so he said, "Sir, they opened fire with pistols. In the distance of 100 meters, that means they don't have submachine guns or rifles."
For the GSG-9, it was more valuable intelligence. The hijackers had limited firepower. They could only shoot at short range. The incident put Mahmoud on edge. He ordered Schumann to prepare for departure.
You get me out of here, I'm going to kill you and blow this plane up now! Now!
Tower. Flight 181. We need fuel immediately.
To resist Mahmoud's demands meant certain bloodshed. Authorities in Dubai agreed to refuel the plane.
Dann plötzlich.
We were suddenly told that the plane was going to take off. I happened to be outside looking at the runway, and I saw it take off, flying right past us.
For Sergeant Major Dieter Fox in the GSG-9, it was a frustrating development. For the passengers and crew aboard Flight 181, the terrifying journey continued. In 1977, the Baader-Meinhof gang would stop at nothing to free their leaders from jail. They kidnapped Hans Martin Schleier, a prominent German businessman. More than a month later, they enlisted Palestinian terrorists to hijack a passenger jet. A team of German GSG-9 commandos followed Flight 181 to cities all over Europe and the Middle East. The terrorists threatened to blow up the plane at noon on October 16th. The GSG-9 now had 4 hours to rescue the passengers. The lead terrorist, a man calling himself Mahmoud, ordered Captain Schumann and co-pilot Wegener to land in southern Yemen.
We circled above the city because we were denied permission to land, but we had to land. We only had a few minutes of fuel left.
Military officials at Aden Airport wanted no part of Flight 181. They blocked the runway with tanks.
With about 10 minutes of fuel left, we decided we had to land, and I suggested we land adjacent to the runway and not directly on the tarmac.
They were out of options. Captain Schumann and co-pilot Wegener prepared for a crash landing.
Wir haben die Kabine etwas vorbereitet.
We readied the cabin, placing the passengers in emergency landing position. We really thought we were going to crash. It was not clear at all that we would survive.
It was a nightmare come true for Beata Keller and the passengers.
We were afraid all the time. It was terrible.
Captain Schumann brought the plane down on a sandy berm beside the runway.
When we finally touched down, parts of the plane's interior were coming down on us due to the impact.
The passengers were badly shaken, but alive. In the cockpit, Mahmoud radioed the tower. He believed he would be welcomed as a hero in Yemen. Instead, he was ordered to leave the country. In all the chaos, the terrorists' deadline passed unobserved. The plane had taken a beating. Captain Schumann needed to inspect the engines and the landing gear. Mahmoud allowed him to leave the plane.
Mahmoud saß mit mir in der vorderen Tür.
Mahmoud was seated with me, and we saw Captain Schumann at the left wheel housing, and he said, "It looks fine here." Then he had to walk around the front to get to the right side, where we, of course, could not observe him.
Where's the captain? Call the tower.
Bis der Mahmoud dann sagte, where is he, Captain? Where is he, Captain? Und
Mahmoud started saying, "Where's the captain?" It occurred to me then that Schumann had been gone too long for an equipment check, which should normally take a few minutes.
1 minute, I am going to blow up this plane.
Mahmoud grew suspicious.
If he's not returned immediately, I'm going to destroy.
He threatened to shoot 5 passengers for every minute Schumann was gone.
Kill someone! Kill someone! Kill someone! I can kill someone now! I can kill.
The tower assured Wegener that Captain Schumann was on his way back to the plane. When Captain Schumann returned, Mahmoud called him a traitor.
On your knees!
He threatened to execute the captain for treason.
Mahmoud had made threats before, but this time was different. I could feel the situation become grave.
Guilty or not guilty? Let me explain!
I remember the moment when Schumann was shot. A female terrorist was eating an apple. She was untouched. That was terrible.
You and you! Drag him! Take him out! Take him to the back! Now!
Captain Jürgen Schumann gave his life trying to protect his passengers.
Move!
I remember 2 passengers helping them drag his body along the floor to the back of the plane. His arm was sticking out, and I saw his wedding band on his finger and thought about what his wife would do when she heard about her husband's death.
Co-pilot Jürgen Wegener was now solely responsible for Flight 181.
4:45 a.m. No more.
We were instructed to leave the country. Now I had the task of seeing to it that we would get fuel and that we would get out of the sand. They pulled the plane out. I started the engine, and the plane began to move at maximum performance.
We're going to Mogadishu.
I didn't even know where Mogadishu was. I had to look it up on the map, and I found it on the very edge, barely on the map.
Wegener found the city on the edge of the Indian Ocean. They were going to Somalia, a country in Africa. The hijacked plane's flight path was monitored by the GSG-9. Colonel Ulrich Wegener plotted the countries within reach.
Because of the limited range of the plane, they couldn't go very far. I was sure. There were only two possibilities where they could go. That means Libya, because of the terrorist connections, and Somalia.
It was bad news from a diplomatic standpoint. Both Libya and Somalia were engaged in brutal armed conflicts. Without proper clearance, the GSG-9 could be shot out of the sky. On October 16th, day 4 of the hijacking, Flight 181 landed in Mogadishu, Somalia. Captain Schumann's body was dumped onto the tarmac. Mogadishu Tower advised the GSG-9 of the tragic development.
Aber wesentlich später
Later came word that the captain of the hijacked plane had been executed. A political solution was no longer an option. The terrorists had crossed the line.
As the GSG-9 flew towards Mogadishu, they revised their assault plan. If the terrorists were willing to kill one hostage, they would clearly kill them all. Negotiations were over. It was time to take action. On October 16, 1977, Palestinian terrorists forced a German passenger jet to land in Mogadishu, Somalia. Their leader, Mahmoud, had executed the pilot. In Germany, businessman Hans Martin Schleier had been held by the Baader-Meinhof gang for over a month. Now, a second deadline was issued. Unless authorities agreed to release 13 convicted terrorists, Schleier would be killed and the plane blown up at 3 p.m. the next day. Germany's elite anti-terrorist unit, the GSG-9, was the hostages' only hope. The chase plane circled Mogadishu airport. They could see the Lufthansa jet on the tarmac. Joachim Hummer would take point in the assault.
We ran through everything, all the different scenarios, including the things that might go wrong and how we might go about solving them.
Although they had permission to land, SAS Commando Barry Davies knew it was a risky maneuver.
It was quite frightening, actually, because there was a war going on and everybody had to sort of scan the skies for fighters.
The GSG-9 pilot made his final approach into Mogadishu. He banked hard left to avoid the hijacked plane's sightlines.
What could we expect? Would we make it to the airport, or would we crash into the water? We turned off all the lights on the aircraft when we started our approach, and of course looked to see where we were. It was a full moon, and it seemed we could almost reach out and touch the water. That's how low we were flying.
The GSG-9 aircraft landed short. They used only half the runway so the hijackers wouldn't spot them.
The pilot of the 707 plane we were in brought the aircraft down into Mogadishu, literally at rooftop level. It was a fantastic piece of flying.
Hans-Jürgen Wisniewski, the German Minister of State, had already arrived in Somalia. He needed to convince the government to allow the GSG-9 to enter the country.
As I landed in Mogadishu, the situation was very tense. I was the only one allowed to leave the plane. Then I had to work to establish trust with the Somalis.
Wisniewski would have to work fast. Mahmoud was preparing to make good on his deadly promise.
Wir wurden also Hände auf den Rücken gefesselt.
We were tied up. We were put in our seats and the seat belts were fastened, so there was no way we could stand up or free ourselves.
Und dann wurde an die Trennwand zwischen Economy Class, also vor Augen aller Passagiere.
The duty-free alcohol in first class was uncorked and poured over us with the remark that we would burn better.
Und dann wurde an die Trennwand zwischen
Furthermore, they attached plastic explosives to the economy class partition in front of everybody. They inserted the detonators.
The hijackers had decided, one way or another, Somalia was the end of the line. At Mogadishu Tower, Minister Wisniewski tried to defuse the situation.
A general wanted to send tanks over to the aircraft. That would have resulted in a bloodbath.
Wisniewski convinced the Somali general that instead of relying on tanks, he should allow the GSG-9 to lead the assault. More importantly, he convinced Mahmoud that the Badr Meinhof prisoners had been released. They were being loaded onto a plane in Germany. According to the minister, they would be in Mogadishu in 7 hours.
I want an update every...
Und ich musste ins Cockpit und musste ausrechnen. Und Mahmoud hat mich
In the
gefragt,
cockpit, Mahmoud asked me to calculate how long it would take to fly from Germany to Mogadishu. I said it would take about 7 to 8 hours. He just wanted to see if my numbers matched those which the tower had given him.
We've won. We have won.
Mahmoud agreed to extend his deadline to 3:30 a.m. He was overjoyed. The government of Germany had finally met his demands. A few hundred yards away, the GSG-9 went to work. Sergeant Major Fox briefed the men on the operation.
Wenn an dem Flugzeug 6 Teams sind, A5 Mann.
This aircraft had 6 doors, which means that 6 teams were necessary. Each team consisted of 5 people. These people have specific positions and duties within the team. There are people who open the doors and others who provide cover.
The commandos carried state-of-the-art weapons.
Ja, wir hatten von der Ausrüstung her unsere komplette Ausrüstung dabei, die wir für solche Einsätze an und für
We were fully equipped with all the gear available to the GSG-9. That means distance weapons, sniper rifles, but also night vision equipment, machine guns of various types, and revolvers.
GSG-9 snipers took up positions around the perimeter of the hijacked plane.
Die Scharfschützen waren so eingesetzt, dass sie an und für sich permanent Einblick hatten, auch mit ihren Nachtsichtgeräten.
The snipers were set up to pretty much have a permanent view, even at night with night vision equipment, into the cockpit area. So they had a frontal view of the plane, or as much as possible under those conditions. As a result, we were able to gain valuable information for our mission, to see who was in the cockpit and in what capacity, to follow the comings and goings, to follow the movement and see what kind of situation we were dealing with. That was important information, especially right before entering.
After 6 days of chasing the hijackers for thousands of miles across 15 countries, the GSG-9 were ready. 200 yards away, Somali soldiers quietly made their way across the runway. Their destination, an aviation fuel truck parked in the middle of the airfield. Minister Wisniewski kept Mahmoud busy on the radio. The commandos approached the aircraft from the rear. They carefully avoided the cockpit's sight lines.
We got all the time information from the recon teams, and nothing changed. The whole situation at the aircraft was very calm. The shades were down on the windows. The doors were closed.
About 50 feet from the plane, the towering lights that illuminated the airfield cast long shadows across the tarmac.
Had the terrorists looked out the window, they could have seen these.
As the commandos approached, Minister Wisniewski continued discussions with Mahmoud. It was critical to keep him in the cockpit.
You understand only one. You will be sure of their condition.
Is that understood?
Understood.
As the assault team reached the aircraft, the commandos assumed their positions.
You have to take your positions silently, which is very difficult because there are many positions that need to be occupied. The element of surprise is essential.
Padded ladders ensured stealth as the commandos scaled the wings of the plane. The slightest noise would alert the terrorists. The 2 British SAS officers hid underneath the cockpit. In seconds, the assault team was in position. They waited for Wegener's signal.
You suddenly realize that this is not a rehearsal anymore. This is serious. All you can think about is the possibility that the doors could be wired with explosives. If that was the case, we were dead.
Update on how long before the prisoners
As
arrive.
Mahmoud reviewed his long list of demands, Wegener checked in with his snipers. They couldn't launch until the co-pilot left the cockpit.
Irgendwas hat mich rausgetrieben.
Something made me get up, and I went to my seat among the passengers.
The sniper team gave Wegener the all clear. They were ready to go.
3, 2, 1.
In the early hours of October 18th, 6 days into the crisis, the GSG-9 launched their operation. Six days had passed since Palestinian hijackers took over a Lufthansa jet. The passengers aboard Flight 181 had lost all hope. They were waiting to die on a runway in Somalia. On October 18th, 1977, Germany's Special Forces, the GSG-9, took up positions outside the aircraft. An assault on the plane would jeopardize the life of kidnapped businessman Hans Martin Schleier. But with 86 innocent lives at stake, the GSG-9 had no choice. The plane was finally on the ground. They had to attack now. British SAS Commando Barry Davies awaited Colonel Wegener's signal. It was 3 a.m. They would beat Mahmoud's deadline by 30 minutes.
And at the appropriate moment, he gave the command to go.
Go!
The Somalis lit the fire at the end of the runway, about 300 meters away. Huge fireball.
It was a classic diversion. The fire drew the hijackers to the front of the plane. Then, all hell broke loose.
Straight away, I flew the stun grenades, which shattered around the aircraft, vibrating the aircraft and putting a lot of light. I turned around instantly and I saw the door. The guy was just dropping away. He pulled the handle, turned it, and he just pulled away.
The commandos entered the aircraft from the front and rear doors. Dieter Fox worked to clear the plane, but the passengers were disoriented.
Also einige haben sehr schnell geschaltet und auch gut mitgeholfen, aber einige wiederum.
Some comprehended the situation very quickly and cooperated. Others, however, were in such a listless state, suffering from the isolation of the past few days. They'd been doused in alcohol, and explosives had been attached to the aircraft, which were quite visible to some of the passengers.
They had to move quickly. The explosives could detonate at any moment.
Irgendwo auf einmal die Angst.
There were troops there to rescue us. The fear was reduced immediately, and all the feelings and the extreme stress were gone. It was coming to an end. The terrorist leader was dead.
3 of the terrorists were killed in the assault. The 4th, a woman, survived. The news reached Stammheim prison in a matter of hours. The Palestinians had failed. The Baader-Meinhof gang would remain behind bars. That night, key members of the gang committed suicide. Andreas Baader and Jean-Karl Raspa shot themselves with smuggled pistols. Gundrin Enslin, Baader's lover, was found hanging in her cell. On October 18, 1977, the 86 surviving hostages aboard Flight 181 finally arrived home in Germany. The GSG-9 were hailed as national heroes.
Wir sind in Frankfurt gelandet. Wir dachten, wir landen.
We landed in Frankfurt, and the hostages deplaned. We heard there was going to be a reception.
The GSG-9 had achieved the impossible, but their victory was bittersweet. A day after the assault, Hans Martin Schleier's body was found inside an abandoned car in France. He had been shot 3 times in the head. Schleier's death and the murder of Lufthansa pilot Jürgen Schumann would serve as a somber reminder of the terrible consequences of terrorism. In the weeks following the liberation of Flight 181, members of the GSG-9 were presented with the nation's highest medal, the Cross of Valor. It was an honor well earned. With just 5 years of training, the GSG-9 had molded itself into one of the finest counterterrorism organizations in the world.